Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to be here. It's always quite exciting to talk to a new audience. Before I get into the meat of my talk, what do you think? What do you feel when you see a picture like this of wind turbines in the landscape? Or maybe you've driven past one of the new wind farms that are going up in various parts of our country. Maybe you feel positive, a warm, fuzzy feeling about hope for our future. Finally, we're getting on the right track. We're generating clean power. Or maybe you feel this pending sense of doom and gloom. Oh, we're changing the landscape again. You might have heard about these devastating impacts on the natural environment, how birds and bats are being killed. Or maybe you haven't even thought about these issues. Maybe this is all new to you. Well, wind energy is often pitted as one of the ultimate green versus green debates. It's suggested by some people that we need to make this choice between generating green, clean power and having to deal with some impacts on our environment. What's going to win, nature or energy? Well, I'm going to try and help unlock the truth about wind energy's impacts on birds, or perhaps a little bit more accurately, what we currently know about wind energy's impacts on birds in South Africa. But before that, just to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, I'll tell you a little bit about what wind energy is, how much wind energy we're likely to see in South Africa, and a little bit of the risks and maybe even some benefits to nature, particularly to birds, because that's what I specialize in. And hopefully by the end of this, you're going to go away with a little bit of more of a nuanced understanding of what the issues are, and importantly, what we need to do to address those issues. At first, a little bit about BirdLife South Africa. So we are an NGO dedicated to the conservation of birds, their habitats and biodiversity. And importantly, we do this through scientifically based programs. And we support the sustainable and equitable use of nature and also encourage people to enjoy and value. The really cool thing about BirdLife South Africa is that we're part of this global network of BirdLife partners, which means that we have this great opportunity to learn from BirdLife partners in other places in the world that have already experienced and dealt with the challenges that we're currently facing. But it also means that we can help and work with partners that are experiencing similar challenges, so we can work together. And together we're quite a powerful group of conservation organizations. So my project, the Birds and Renewable Energy Project, has been going since 2012. And our goal is really to try and help avoid, and if we can't avoid, minimize the impact of renewable energy on birds and their habitats. Just like our broader organization, we do this by promoting scientific and evidence-based decisions. So a lot of what I do is I take the foundations of biodiversity knowledge and try and feed that into policy and advice, and ultimately the implementation of renewable energy facilities. And importantly, we take what we're learning from operational and proposed wind farms, identifying where those knowledge gaps are, and we feed it down to the researchers and scientists and say, guys, we don't have the answers. We need you to help. So that's pretty much how we approach things. Now, no discussion about renewable energy, I think, is complete without looking at where our energy currently comes from in South Africa. And at the moment, we're looking at around 85% of our electricity production comes from coal. And I'm sure that you'll agree that that's not really a great or sustainable solution. Not only are coal-fired power stations really ugly, but they're also polluting. They're incredibly damaging to our water resources. Their impact on human health and well-being, they're just not a great thing when it comes to climate change either, which is, I'd hope to this audience, quite an obvious thing. And quite honestly, South Africa per capita is doing pretty damn badly when it comes to our CO2 emissions. We are one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. So you can see the warm colors on this map here, the darker the red, the more per capita emissions. So South Africa really is not currently in a brilliant situation. But there is some good news. Despite what some people tell you, year on year, there's a really good increase in the amount of renewable energy that's being generated throughout the world, particularly big growth in both wind and solar energy. And even organizations like the International Energy Association, which previously haven't been particularly pro-renewable energy, are now talking about how we need to stop new coal, oil and gas projects this year if we're going to limit the rise in temperatures to 1.5 degrees and achieve net zero. And they've even mapped pathways of how we can do this. The really interesting thing with renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, that's no longer, the growth in it's no longer just driven by the need to reduce our carbon emissions. It actually now makes financial sense too. So the cost of generating energy from coal is actually greater than the cost of generating energy from wind or solar energy. So there are a lot of really good reasons why we can expect to see more and more wind energy. So what do I mean by wind energy? I'm not talking about the little turbines that you might see on individual houses. That's a whole another topic for discussion. I'm talking about these big structures in the landscape that look a little bit like fans. And they convert kinetic energy of the wind into electricity. Typically in South Africa, the size of these big structures is quite enormous. We're looking at around, and this is on average, 100 meters to hub height, about 30 meters tall, 30 stories tall, sorry. And the blades are around 60 meters long. The size of turbines in South Africa and worldwide is increasing almost every year. But on average, at the moment, we're looking at around 3 megawatt turbines proposed. That's the sort of size I'm talking about now. And if you go on figures from the Department of Energy, a 3 megawatt turbine can fuel approximately 3,300 homes. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's kind of the amount of power that a turbine could generate. And you might be surprised worldwide where the most wind power is. You're probably all familiar with how many wind farms there are in the United States, but in fact, China is generating an enormous amount. They're really shifting quite quickly to increase more and more wind power. Countries like Spain, Germany, Britain, all moving towards more and more wind power. Globally, around 5% of electricity production currently comes from wind. Countries like Spain and Germany, they're looking at between 20 and 25% of the electricity comes from wind energy. And if you look at Africa, we seem to be lagging quite far behind. South Africa, we're at about 3%. And that's not because we lack the resource. So this map is the wind energy potential of Africa, with the warmer colors indicating areas where there's a better wind resource. And a report by the International Renewable Energy Association suggests by 2030, around 11% of Africa's power could come from wind. And you'll notice South Africa down at the bottom there has particularly good resource. But it's not just South Africa. Another study suggests, I just want to double check my figures, that 27 countries in Africa on their own have enough potential wind energy to fuel the entire continent. Or looking at it a different way, Africa has a potential to meet its own energy needs 250 times over. So we've got really good onshore resource, and that's not even talking about offshore, which is something I think we can expect to see in the future, but not on our immediate horizon. So South Africa, we have a small amount of wind energy at the moment, but our energy roadmap, the Integrated Resources Plan, foresees that the amount of installed wind energy capacity is likely to increase just under six-fold by 2030. So that means, sort of, given the current size and capacity of turbines, that we could expect to see around 5,000 turbines in our landscape by 2030. Just to put it in perspective, the last time I checked, I think we've got around 900 wind turbines that are currently operational in South Africa, with another about 400 that are under construction. So it's quite a significant increase that we can expect. So let's talk a little bit about the impacts. The direct footprint of wind energy is actually a lot smaller than other technologies, for example, solar photovoltaic facilities, which require relatively large areas of land to be sterilized for other uses, around 3 hectares per megawatt. The direct footprint is comparatively small, but if you look at the size of this foundation here, these are little people for scale, it's pretty big. But perhaps more significant than the direct habitat loss associated with wind energy is the potential for indirect impacts associated with habitat fragmentation and disturbance. Wind farms in South Africa typically cover thousands of hectares, and each wind turbine needs to be connected by roads and power lines, etc. So it's put in the wrong place. We can't underestimate the impacts on the actual habitats. I think it was Johan that mentioned that the impacts of power lines on bustards in India. And that's something that people often overlook when they talk about the impacts of wind energy. And I suspect for some species, the power lines actually present a bigger threat than the turbines themselves. So if power lines aren't well designed, birds can be electrocuted or collide with the power lines that evacuate power, or sometimes even connect the turbines to each other, although they're generally underground, not always. But the impact people talk most about when it comes to birds is the impact of bird collisions. So birds can and are killed when they collide with the rapidly moving turbine blades. Now, if you see a wind turbine, it actually looks like those turbine blades are moving quite slowly. But in reality, the tips are moving 1 to 100 kilometers an hour. This is a picture of a beautiful Marshall eagle that Dr. Rob Simmons, who we also spoke about earlier, actually witnessed being struck by a turbine blade. And the reason for this happening are multiple and various. And I think, in a nutshell, birds simply haven't evolved to perceive and avoid these massive, fast-moving structures in their flight paths. Some birds, like vultures, are even blind in the direction that they're flying in. So some people suggest, put them in lights and make them more visible. But if vultures literally can't see the direction they're flying and they're looking down and to their flock mates next door to them, maybe that's not going to work. So how many birds are we talking? Some people, like our friend Donald Trump, says if you go to a wind farm, you're going to literally see hundreds of birds beneath turbines. Is this true? Well, in reality, it's actually quite unusual to witness a bird collision like Rob Simmons did. In South Africa, we know more or less how many birds are killed per turbine, because thanks to our quite rigorous environmental impact assessment system and guidance that BirdLife South Africa and EWT have put out, wind farms do monitor their impacts on birds, and they report those impacts to BirdLife South Africa. So we know that through independent people searching beneath the turbines, that on average, about one bird carcass is found beneath a turbine every year, which isn't a huge number, but we also know that people aren't searching. It's not feasible to expect people to search beneath a turbine every day. So they're generally searched about once a week. And it's actually quite difficult to identify or notice a bird carcass, particularly if it's in sort of fairly high dense shrubs. And during the time that people are searching, carcasses could be removed by scavengers. So there's some calculations that we could do to estimate the actual number of birds that are killed. And in South Africa, on average, we're looking at around 4.5 birds being killed per turbine per year. So around 2 birds per megawatt a year. But I need to caution that this is an average figure. And in reality, there's a huge amount of variation, both between wind farms and between wind turbines. If you add that all together, although the figure might not seem huge, if you project into the future how many turbines we're seeing, we can expect literally thousands of those to be killed each year. And currently in the States, recent estimates were that between 140,000 and 500,000 birds are killed through turbine collisions each year. Now, does it matter? If you talk to proponents of wind energy, they love to quote the stat. I can guarantee you, and I've even seen it in fairly reputable popular science magazines. More birds are killed by cats, cars, and windows. If I could have a dime for every time I heard that, I would be very rich. And it's my mission to prove that this logic is severely flawed. And I'll tell you why. We all know that cats are responsible for killing lots of mice, and they're responsible for killing lots of birds. But nobody in their right mind is going to say that, although it's technically correct that more mammals are killed by cats than poaching, that we don't need to worry about rhino poaching. It makes absolutely no sense to lump all mammals together into one group. And it's the same for wind energy. While it might be technically correct to say that more birds are killed by cats than by wind turbines, it says nothing about the species that are killed, about whether those species are at risk of extinction already, or are they being threatened by these impacts or not. So lumping species simply makes no sense. So these broad groups of mammals or birds, it's not very helpful to the debate at all. I hope you agree. So which species are being killed? Well, again, from looking at monitoring data from wind farms in South Africa, and I need to caution that wind farms in its infancy, and most of the wind turbines are located in a relatively small number of different habitats. But we already have over 130 different species that have come up as a fatality, at least one fatality. That's a big chunk of species. And what we did is we looked at those species that were exposed to the risk of wind turbines. So those that were recorded either during impact assessment, or people mentioned SABAC atlasing. So those that were potentially at risk, likely to be in the area of a wind farm, and those that came up as their fatality. And then we did some species accumulation curves to predict what will happen in the future. And we anticipate that around 42% of the species exposed to wind turbines are likely to be at some risk of collisions. That's pretty scary, or is it? Well, if we're just talking about common species like red-capped lark or bockmackerel, perhaps it's not such a big deal, unless we're talking about maintaining habitats in pristine conditions. So perhaps we do need to be quite careful about if we're putting wind turbines in protected areas or near protected areas, for example. But over a third of the carcasses that we're finding beneath turbines are of raptors. And I'm sure talking to the converted here, you all know the important ecological role that raptors play. They're also often quite naturally scarce, and they're also often threatened with extinction already. So some of the birds that we particularly finding conflicts with are Burroughs eagle, black harrier. Somebody mentioned black harrier. We've got 1,000 mature individuals left, and we are getting a concerning, albeit small, number of fatalities. But because there's so few, annual fatality rates of just a handful could mean the imminent extinction of the species. There's been some quite important but not yet published work on population viability of the species and its inability to withstand additional pressures. Cape vulture in the eastern part of the Eastern Cape, there's really good wind resource, but these guys need a lot of space. They move great distances, and unfortunately, we're also getting a number of fatalities from wind farms. So what do we do about all of this? Well, planning is really, really key. And by that, I mean that the location of a wind farm. So just like we don't want to see a wind farm on Table Mountain, you don't want to see a wind farm right next to a vulture colony. But it's also the individual location of wind turbines. It can be critical. There's been some really great work done by Hawkwatch and modeling the collision risk for Burroughs eagle. So this map on the right here, the darker blue are areas that are generally close to eagle nests, and the yellow is areas where eagles are less likely to occur. This is actually a real example. Little dots are where wind farm had proposed turbines. And by knowing where the eagle nests are and overlaying it with proposed turbines, we can then make some really good recommendations that the wind farm should relocate those turbines and avoid the significant risk of collisions. There are also quite rigorous standards for impact assessment, for data collection, so you can understand where the critical breeding sites are and how birds are moving through the landscape. So you can realign the turbine layout to minimize risk to birds. There's been some quite exciting work done in Norway looking at the design of wind turbines. So they've experimented painting one of the turbine blades black. And the idea is this reduces what's known as motion smear. And they've successfully, in this experiment, reduced the collision risk by up to around 70%. We're really looking forward to seeing this tested in South African wind farms. There are a couple of obstacles we need to overcome, and it's more likely we're going to see a blade painted red than black. And I do have reservations that it's going to work for all species, but I'm certainly excited to see what happens with our Burroughs eagles. Once a wind farm's operational, there are also a whole bunch of steps that we can take. For example, they've had some success with manipulating the habitat beneath turbines to reduce attracting birds that are looking for prey items, for example. Or you can shut down the turbines, so literally stop them rotating when birds are in the area and at risk of collision. And you can either do that through using human observers or technology such as radar or camera devices. Still very early days in South Africa, and we do have some challenges with this, but there are certainly options that can be implemented to reduce risks if mistakes happen. And it's also really important to remember that we have alternatives. Wind energy is great in the right place, but it's not the only option to generate clean power. And in many environments, solar energy might be more appropriate. People also often ask me about bird-friendly devices, and this picture on the right is a vortex bladeless turbine. And there's certainly lots of quite exciting developments, but unfortunately at this stage, most of the bird-friendly devices aren't at the don't have the same capacity as our large-scale, utility-scale turbines that we're seeing. Typically, the bird-friendly devices we see are more appropriate for small-scale embedded generation, fueling 1 or 2 houses. But hopefully, and I really say hopefully, we'll see better developments in the future. Now, it's not all bad news. I've got this picture up here of a cow sheltering under the shade of a wind turbine, just to remind us that our climate is changing, and we're looking at around 24 to 50% of our bird species being threatened by climate change. And it's quite difficult to weigh up these sort of immediate threats of birds being killed by turbines with the sort of more broad scale threat of climate change. But there could even be more local scale positive impacts of wind energy. So the introduction of wind energy to an area could mean significant investment in the management of a farm, for example. And if we get the location right, where there's already a low enough risk, I do believe that there is potential benefits for the environment by injecting money to do, for example, invasive alien clearing, marking fences, other conservation activities that could benefit the environment. So I promised to tell you the truth. Well, I'm not sure if I have, because the truth is it's complicated. As people like to put things in neat boxes, that something's either good or it's bad, but the world isn't actually like that. Wind energy might be greener, but it's not environmentally neutral by any stretch of the imagination. And not all wind farms are equal. Some sites are better than others, and some developers, quite honestly, are better than others. And we really do, as a conservation community, have our work cut out for us to make sure that wind energy doesn't damage the environment. So what do we need to do looking to the future? We need to try and guide the right technology in the right place. And that means we need to unlock resources to improve strategic level planning and research to support decisions of where the best places to locate wind farms are. We need to be able to fix and learn from our mistakes. And by that, I mean, we need to do a lot when it comes to adaptive management, investigating ways for different species and different environments, how we can minimize the risk of collisions, both locally and cumulatively. And we also, quite honestly, need the environmental oversight and enforcement from government to make sure that wind farms do the right thing when they're required to. And to be honest, I am a little bit concerned about the lack of that at the moment. And sort of zooming out, I think we need to put more pressure on investors to make the most of our climate change investments. We need to look at what the trade-offs are and find the synergies, because it doesn't make sense that we invest a lot in climate change and then land up degrading the natural environment that we so depend on to build our resilience against climate change. So lots of work to do, and it's a really exciting field for new researchers out there. There's plenty of opportunities to learn and do some research. So I'm hoping that I'll spark some interest from some people out there. Thank you so much. If you have any questions or suggestions that I don't get to in the chat, here's my email address. Welcome to drop me an email. There's also plenty of resources on our website, and I will do my best to answer your questions now.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was great. So I have 2 or 3 questions, possibly. So my first question is, what are the regulations in place for people wanting to put up wind turbines at this stage? Is there any process that they go through or not?
Yes, there's actually really rigorous processes. So all wind farms more than 10 megawatts need to get environmental authorization. And one of the things that we did at BirdLife South Africa is we developed guidelines on how the environmental impact assessments for birds need to be. And you would be surprised how rigorous and lengthy these processes can be. So you're looking at a minimum of a year of impact assessment surveys for average site, but for areas where there are significant sensitivities, they need to do research for at least 2 years. And once they have the environmental authorization, only then can they bid their projects to what's known as the Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, which gives them a license to generate power. And even once the wind farm's up and running, the management is governed by something called an environmental management program, which requires them to monitor their impacts, and then if significant impacts are observed, technically they're meant to do something about it. And that's a little bit where things fall down a bit in South Africa, but we're learning, we're improving. It's, yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah.
So my next question might be a bit ignorant, but you mentioned that we might be painting the one wind turbine red. Is there a reason for the red and instead of the black like the other research suggested?
That, and it's not definite yet, and it's still very early days, but that's the Civil Aviation Authority. For some reason, well, firstly, the Civil Aviation Authority dictates how the turbines could look, because it presents a risk to airplanes, and for some reason they seem to be more comfortable with red than black. I can't explain why. But
okay, cool, thanks. And then my last question, sorry, I'll make this quick. So I know that it was about birds, but I also know that there are a few bat species that people have picked up. Have you guys seen some bat species flying into these wind turbines?
In fact, Eleanor's online and she could probably answer this question better. But in terms of numbers, more bats are actually killed than birds at turbines. They're a lot harder to find because you can imagine most bats are pretty small. But can I hand over to you, Eleanor, if you're still on the line?
Hi there. Yep. Yeah, we're working under the same rules as the birds. So we have the surveys, the pre-construction surveys that they have to go out and check where the bats are and try and move the turbines into non-bat areas. It doesn't always work, but we try. And then, yes, they also have to go out and search for, hopefully, a year and check for bat bodies. But as Sam said, sometimes they're difficult to find. So you also have to check how good your searchers are being at actually finding bat bodies. So it's a big, long process, very complicated process. If you want to look up sabaa, sabaa.org.za, that's our website, and it'll give you the basics of it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I guess you were mentioning earlier that adding a light would help the the vultures, but that in that case it would not help the bats.
No, no. In fact, we usually say, please make sure for the transformers and so on. Please make sure the lights are facing down onto the ground, and they're very muted at night, so it doesn't attract insects and therefore attract bats. Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thanks, Sam.
Okay.
Thanks, Sam, for what was, I think, quite a balanced sort of conversation on wind turbines. I've got two questions. So the first one is wind versus solar. Renewable energy is not necessarily good energy, as in 100%, only good things. And if you wanted to compare wind and solar in South Africa, they've got very similar costs. They've got quite similar, I think, rates in terms of energy production per day, roughly 25 to 30% sort of output. But there's a definite impact on birds from wind turbines. Now, why is BirdLife seemingly supportive of wind turbines when they could maybe make a stronger statement on renewable energy and what's best for the BirdLife environment, but still staying within renewable energy? You did mention solar. You did mention that it might have a lower impact, but BirdLife doesn't, from what I've seen, seem to have a real strong stance on that. Are you saying that wind turbines will happen and that you just might as well make them as good as one can in terms of where they're situated? Or should BirdLife maybe take a stronger stance?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad that you raised that, because a lot of people do believe that we should be taking a stronger stance against wind energy, and solar energy. Okay, rewind. Storage is becoming a much cheaper, more viable option, but the sun doesn't shine at night, so we do need a mix of energy. There's no country that relies on one source of power alone. It's about a mix of energy. So we need the right technology in the right place. So until we get storage right, which hopefully I didn't mention, but hopefully it will become right in the future, we believe that we can't just go for solar energy, and that we do need some wind energy in the mix. And we do believe that with the right location and with the right management, those impacts can be minimized.
Thanks for that. I have seen, if you look at the distribution of wind in South Africa, we do have some interesting wind profiles which lend themselves into complementing solar power. So I suppose it does work. My second question really is on the conflict of interest. I saw some of the billboards of BirdLife around town. Within Investec Bank, I'm not picking on Investec, I'm going to pick on all the banks here. There's a proper conflict of interest there. The banks are making money from energy projects, whether they're renewable or not. And recently, they all came now not to fund coal power projects, but that's really only because there was public pressure for them not to do so. The interest rates they charge for these renewable energy projects are not environmentally friendly. So there's a conflict there. Do you think it's the right thing to have a sponsor who is a bank, who is a primary sponsor and funder of these renewable energy projects? It's their interests that they happen. They don't want them not to happen. So there's just a conflict there that worries me, to see such a large profile logo, very similar on a billboard that really is a BirdLife South Africa billboard.
I do understand the concern with that. But I can guarantee you that there has never been any interference. Our relationship with Investec is strictly neutral. They've never, in fact, if anything, they're for my liking, almost even two hands off because of this concern of the conflict. But it makes sense for a big organization with a lot of money and a lot of interest in an industry to try and make it greener. And quite honestly, in South Africa, in the early days of wind energy, it wasn't government that was influential in requiring more rigorous impact assessments. It was the financiers. Big banks are required to comply with things like the Equator Principle. And they were subjecting wind farms to really stringent requirements that in those days, government wasn't necessarily doing. So financiers have actually had in my view, a very positive influence on the impact assessment and management of wind energy facilities, including the operation of wind energy facilities. So I understand the concern, but I can definitely guarantee you that it's not well-founded.
Thank you. Thanks for those answers.
Thanks, Sam. What a great talk. I've only got one question. I'm feeling inadequate. Here in the UK, there's a lot of focus on offshore wind energy, as well as the stuff we've got on land. Do you know if anyone, well, probably not where you are, but anyone else looking at the impact on, ocean-going birds and all that sort of stuff?
So there's been a lot of research on it in the UK. In South Africa, I know of one proposal in the pipeline that we've tried to reach out and engage with. I don't know how far it's got, but from my understanding, and I do stand to be corrected, offshore wind energy is something that we're likely to see in the sort of medium future as floating wind turbines become more feasible. And there's certainly a huge amount of work that we need to do in terms of improving planning for offshore wind, but I think we've got a little bit of time in that way.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Now I'm going to move to the chat section quickly, just to start off a few questions there. From Sibylla Rietmiller. Hello, Sibylla, I hope you're well. Do we have similar data for bird kills by power lines, as you mentioned? This is from previous, a while back when you were still addressing us.
That's a really good question, and no, we've got a good idea broadly about which birds are affected, because there's a program that EWT and ESCOM run. So anybody who finds a bird carcass can report it into the central database. But across the countryside, the data isn't collected in as a rigorous way as it is done for wind energy facilities. So yes, we know which species are being killed, but there isn't that rigorous scientific oversight for most power lines in South Africa. There are 1 or 2 trial sites that they're doing, but yeah.
Thank you very much. There's a few, no, it's not questions, but a few statements in the chat about the speed of the fans that you mentioned. And without going into it, I'm terribly excited about this. And this is purely scientific and purely empirical. But for everyone, go and read a bit about the physics, the mathematics, and the mechanics behind these turbines. It's absolutely fascinating. Just taking into account what it takes to make those things turn and the amount of electricity they produce. From Nolene Bonneau in the chat section, I've heard that these turbines affect cows, that they don't produce as much milk as they normally do. Have you come across this?
There are lots of claims to that effect. There's also claims of people being disturbed by the noise. I stand to be corrected. But as I understand it, there isn't any evidence for that. And in fact, I showed that picture of cows sheltering under the turbine. So there's an argument that they do benefit from it. But I'm not an expert on this topic, and I'm not going to make any claims for or against it.
So if there is anyone that is an expert on cow behavior and the influence of the turbines, please jump up and down. I will give you a chance. Marty, I see your hand is up. Please, the screen is yours, or the mic.
Hi guys, and thanks Sam for a very interesting talk. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat. Sorry, the chat. I'm on my phone at the moment. So my one question was actually about the speed and whether from a design point of view, it wouldn't be possible to possibly slow the speed down a little bit to a speed that birds can see easier, and possibly to try and avoid some of the impacts. And then the other part of my question was the viability of possibly, because I think there's a lot less bird flight at night as opposed to maybe during the day or whatever. So whether there isn't possibilities of looking at different hours for them operating, or would that make them completely unviable economically? I mean, I understand they cost probably millions, if not billions, to put up. So when it's up, they want it to run 24/7. But is there a sort of a mindset shift that needs to happen to try and actually avoid peak times when birds are flying, etc.?
Okay, those are 2 questions there. To answer the speed question, that's a really good suggestion. I've never come across that. And I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to even attempt to answer it. But what I can tell you is that the cut-in speed, so the point at which the wind turbines start turning, is something that they look at as mitigation, both for bats, and we've also proposed it for some lark species that display only in low wind conditions. So basically the recommendation is that those turbines only start rotating in higher wind conditions. So the wind farm doesn't lose much generating potential, and the birds at risk and the bats at risk aren't flying under those conditions. But there's a huge amount of variation between species. Some species will fly in higher wind conditions, other not. So you need to develop a solution for the species of concern. The second question about curtailment, so stopping turbine or only operating turbines during certain times of day is definitely something that is on the cards for some wind farms. particularly in areas where there is big migration routes and very predictable movements. Some birds do fly at night, for example, flamingos. So yeah, again, we need to develop a solution specific for that wind farm. Curtailment generally means not operating on farm during a risk period, but that means quite a big chunk of time. So what's generally preferable is that shutdown on demand. So when there's actually physical observed risk of birds colliding, because your loss of power is a lot less. So that's definitely something that is considered.
Cool, thanks very much.
Thank you, Marty. I can't see any other hands or people waving at me. Just maybe you can quickly, you did mention migratory birds, but Michelle Swanepoel from TUT, thank you for an incredible talk. How are bird migrations affected by wind turbines? You briefly mentioned it now in the previous answer, but maybe just a bit more if you have.
So it's probably more like how bird migrations affect the location and operation of wind farms. In South Africa, it's a little bit different to parts of the world like Portugal or Spain, where they have these massive migrations of birds going through quite a narrow bottleneck. And there's something like shutdown on demand or curtailment is feasible. In South Africa, we're at the end of a migratory route, so you don't have those masses of birds generally. The flight paths are generally much more localized. So it's not such a big issue in South Africa, which is possibly a benefit for South Africa, but it also makes mitigation a little bit harder.
Thank you very much. Another one from Michelle. Maybe if you can't, maybe someone else has an idea or two. Have they ever considered training dogs to help find bats near turbines? Maybe we can ask Michelle if she needs to elaborate on that. But if you have an answer, Sam, that's great.
I have an answer. Indeed, they do use dogs to find bird and bat carcasses. Dogs are much more efficient at finding carcasses. They work really quickly, and because of the sense of smell, they often identify carcasses that people won't. The problem with dogs is that they need to be on site, and often wind farms are located in quite remote areas. They can't operate in dry conditions. They need to be housed, they're trained. So there are a whole bunch of limitations. And in South Africa, one of the biggest limitations we encountered was that the carcass searching team is generally moderately skilled. So they might have a matric, but it's a huge job creation benefit. And people don't want to see dogs replacing people. So wind farms would rather employ a team of carcass searchers than a dog. It does mean there's a lot more uncertainty. So our predicted fatality rates have a much bigger range of uncertainty than we would have if we use dogs.
Oh, well, I mean, without man or woman, the dogs won't have a job. So maybe service dogs, it's exactly the same point. Okay, cool, lovely. Thank you very much. And Michelle, thank you for that question. Another one from Sibylla. Critics also mention noise pollution and vibration by wind turbines if they are close to residential areas. But noise would have also affect animals, I assume?
Indeed, it could, and it's a very understudied area. So in South Africa, generally the recommendation is wind farms are located quite far away from human dwellings. But in places like Europe, where they don't have the luxury of as much space as we do, they've certainly encountered problems with wind farms causing a disturbance. It does tend to vary quite a lot according to the turbines that they select. But yes, absolutely, the noise, it can interfere with birds communicating with each other or other animals. Lots of work to be done in that field.
Brilliant. See, so all the TUT students, if you want to, when you're done with Dr. Ogilvy, you want to specialize, there's something for you to do, okay? From Mike, Mike, I'm not sure to which area or country you are referring to, maybe South Africa. How many wind farms are there now? And do you know how many may be planned? I'm thinking of the effect on our landscape, as many of the farms I've seen are in pristine areas.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of wind farms are located in really remote areas. So at the moment, I think it's around 30 odd wind farms. But as I said in my presentation, I'm not sure how many wind farms we're looking, but we're looking at around 5,000 turbines in our landscape by 2030. So that's a lot.
That is a lot. That's a lot. Thank you very much. Then, Dr. Cheryl, your hand is up. I hope I didn't step on your toes.
No, I've just got a comment, Sam. One of the things you keep mentioning is 2030, 2030, and that's one of the Sustainable Development Goal dates, where we got to get the cleaner and better energy, become more wiser by 2030. And I know the collisions are there, but do you think there could be a way to actually slow down these collisions, as you kind of mentioned already? Do you think it could happen? Or do you think we try to do the sustainable development way, but we actually messing up biodiversity as well when we come to this? I don't know. I'm busy fighting my brain tonight. I've had a long day.
Look, the 2030 is also the targets that's set in our energy roadmap. So the integrated resources plan.
Not linked to SDGs, Sam?
No, it's actually our energy plans. I don't think there might be some link that I'm not aware of, but I could be wrong. I don't think we're going to slow down wind energy, but I do think that, and we are having a significant influence on the location. So BirdLife, although people claim we don't take a strong enough stand sometimes, we do appeal, and we have often stopped wind farm developments in the wrong place. Just today, I had a conversation with a wind farm developer who's looking at a place in the Eastern Cape, and I told him he's crazy to even start the EIA, and that happens more often than not, that before even formal processes start, the developers say, oh, this is just too high risk, and walk away. So we can and do influence the layout, and yeah, we're trying very hard to influence the management of the wind farms. So once they're up and running, it all isn't lost. We can mitigate those impacts. It's just a question of whether there's a political will to enforce it, both from the part of the wind farm operators and from government. So that, quite honestly, currently is my biggest headache.
Yeah, because it is
entirely possible to do that.
Yeah, because it would be nice to see whether the SDG 7 is actually linked into this, because I'm getting a little bit worried that we enforcing these SDGs, but it's going to have some kind of major impact on the biodiversity in some way.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of very careful planning and guidance and strategic thinking to get it right.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Cheryl, Sam. Thank you. Another one from Rowan. Wind turbines do impact the microclimate, and this may have a more serious negative effect than turbine collisions on local fauna. What studies have been done on this, if you have any ideas, Sam?
Again, not my area of expertise. Indeed, it does impact on the local climate. I don't know of any studies on how this affects birds. I suspect it's more likely to affect insects and crop production. But again, that's a field that's wide open for study. And just another reminder why we don't want to be putting turbines in pristine environments.
Lovely, thank you very much. Anyone else? If you wave your hand, I am paging through the grid now. If you have any questions, any hands, any suggestions, any comments, that would be absolutely wonderful. No one. Oh, there we go. Andy, your hand's up. Lovely.
Yeah, thanks, Rune. Not directly linked to wind power, but I was looking at the volume of coal mines and things like that you've still got in South Africa. We cut out a lot of the coal in production of power in the UK. I just wonder if anybody out there in your gang is thinking about how those areas, the old industrial coal mine areas and things, are going to be rehabilitated. Because surprisingly, we found, I think, in the UK, and this is only through me picking up on articles, quite a lot of the abandoned industrial areas, because they're just being left to nature, are actually becoming what we consider really good nature reserves. They're not pristine, but they're becoming remarkable habitats. So I don't know if anybody's looking at how your big industrial areas like that could, maybe they're wind farm sites in the future, and or maybe they're, you know, nature reserves of the future as well, if we get them right. Just a thought.
Sam?
That's definitely not so much on the rehabilitation side, but it's definitely something that's come up in terms of planning of renewable energy facilities. So shutting down coal-fired power stations also implies a huge loss of jobs. So there's big movement about calling for a just energy transition. Coal-fired power stations also have access to the grid. So it makes complete and utter sense to put solar energy facilities near there. Unfortunately, generally speaking, the wind energy resource isn't that great there, but it's absolutely something that they're looking at when it comes to solar energy, and it makes perfect sense.
I think you can apply this not only to coal mines, but any type of mine that closed down because of loss of production or wherever. We have a few of those in South Africa, so it's a brilliant idea. Something to think about. Thank you very much, Andy. Eleanor, you were next in line. Hand was up. There we go.
Okay, just a couple of comments. People were kind of surprised at how fast the tips of those turbine blades are turning. Just a reminder of that old playground game where you all stand in a row and one person stands still and everybody else runs. And the person at the very end, after 6 people, you are running so darn fast. That's what turbine blades do.
Yes.
So yeah, the end of them turns very fast. And
good old momentum.
just one comment, and Sam's touched on it, but some of our developers are super people. They do their very best to be environmentally friendly. They engage with the specialists, they move turbines, and then you have a few of the others. And yeah, I agree with Sam. We have a difficulty in engaging with them because they're not scared of the consequences. So that's a problem. Yeah. And yeah, I don't think personally, I'm not as pro wind turbines as Sam is. I think they're fine in some areas. They work well. But I think we're not really in bats, especially, we're not really at the stage where we can say for definite, that's a good area, that's a bad area. I think there needs to be more at local municipal level to make to give. I mean, personally, in my house in Durban here, I've been trying to put solar PV on my roof for I don't know how long, and you jump through the most incredible hoops. If the municipalities would make it easier, it would be a whole lot easier.
100%, and it's really expensive. I'm actually completely off grid, and I tell you, yeah, my bank balance cried.
But it should be possible to.
Sorry, yeah. No, Eleanor, carry on, please.
It should be possible to do it bit by bit. If we could get two-way, if we could get the municipalities to agree to two-way meters, you know, you could start off this year putting in 4 panels and next year putting in another 4, you know. We just don't have the political willpower.
Nope.
Completely.
Yeah, exactly.
Completely agree. Chris, I'm going to.
Well, I just wanted to mention.
No, go.
Sorry, everyone.
No, you can go before I give Marty a chance.
Just wanted to mention to Eleanor, thank you for your comments, Eleanor, appreciate. There was in the chat, Richard Hussey Googled it while we were talking. They're talking up to speeds of 138 to 189 kilometers per hour sometimes, obviously depending on location. So it's crazy how fast they could go. We didn't really always, it is incredible. Over to Marty.
Yes, Marty, I'm going to ask you. There we go.
Sorry about that. Just the one comment that you had made about the comparison made, or saying that cats also kill a lot of birds. So wind turbines, kill a lot less. So by comparison, it's not an issue. And I agree with you 100%. But it's actually a pet sort of soapbox of mine is this whole cat issue, and the amount of birds that domestic cats do kill. So I think it's when people say that, I think the answer is turbines kill, and it's important to look at that because of biodiversity and whatever, and also cats kill, and we should also look at that. It's also very important to have owners of domestic cats be more responsible for their pets, to not kill as much of the indigenous flora. I mean, there's studies done where areas are almost completely depleted of all sorts of indigenous flora, whether it's rodents or birds or anything. So I think it's an important actual thing to also endorse as well.
100%.
And then just the one other thing in terms of other technologies, because you're in this sort of field, I was wondering if there are any advancements in energy generation from wave movements in the sea. I mean, we spoke about offshore wind, but are you aware of any improvements in technology that would actually harness the power of waves? And I think that would possibly be even less destructive to hopefully birds and fish and all of the other things in the environment.
There certainly are advancements, and I quite honestly don't know why we don't see more of it worldwide. So I suspect there's some technical limitations, and I know that in South Africa, our coastline is just so rough and wild that it's not ideally suited to wind energy. No, sorry, wave energy. Although there is a small facility, I think, in Hermanus. They've got a small power generation facility linked to Abalone Farm, something like that. But I suspect it's more suited to small scale generation, but I'm not an expert in the field. But the area really to watch in South Africa is the development of floating turbines. I think that's going to be a real game changer for us.
But surely that's a massive risk for things like albatross and
absolutely.
All of those
100%, yeah.
That are, I mean,
I'm not saying I'm happy about it.
Yeah.
I'm saying we need to prepare for it. It's a big concern for things like albatrosses, 100%.
Because I don't even, I mean, sorry, I'm speaking from ignorance, but I don't think that you can even plot their flight patterns or anything like that in the ocean. I mean, I think they just go everywhere.
Yeah, I think we can plot where they most likely to be, but it is a bit like vultures, fairly random.
Well, thanks, man.
Oh, thank you, Marty.
Marty, somebody's worried about your cough there.
Yes, Sibylla is very worried about your cough.
If I'm honest, I've just recovered from a week of COVID, but I'm doing fine. Thanks.
Okay, cool.
Wow.
Best of luck,
Wow.
Marty. Best of luck. Best of luck, and stay safe.
Yeah, Marty, then we all concerned because if you're not in to ask questions, then we're gonna
Exactly, you're a main contributor when it comes to
please.
Alistair, I'm going to give it over to you now. There we go.
Hi, thanks Sam for a great talk. So my background is once upon a time in the far past was the independent ECO on the Siri development in the Western Cape. And I just wanted to make a comment on Eleanor's statement earlier with regards to the two-way grid situation. What you'll probably find is it's got nothing to do with your municipality not allowing you to feed power into the grid, but more the South African grid code prevents you from putting power back, and that grid code is controlled by Eskom, and it is also controlled by your not your independent power producers, but your NERSA, so the National Energy Regulations Board. So that is why we don't have a two-way system in this country, and why our grid code prevents us from putting power back into the grid. Yeah, so that's just my comment in terms of thanks for a fantastic talk. There's definitely a lot more that we can learn out of this industry going forward. You did touch a little bit on solar, and one of the projects that I was going to get involved in when I was still with Eskom was concentrated solar, which I would say is probably worse for BirdLife than wind is. Any comments?
Yeah, so concentrated solar, you get two different kinds. You get a central receiving tower where there are a whole bunch of mirrors that direct the sun's energy into the central receiving tower. And indeed, birds can get fried when they fly through this area of concentrated solar energy. At the moment, we've got one concentrated solar power tower facility in South Africa, up near Uppington, and another one's under construction. Indeed, BirdLife were very worried about it, developed guidelines. We even appealed a couple of projects. The good news for now is that it's, I think, due to the cost, it hasn't really been included in our energy plans going forward. And it seems that we're getting more and more of the trough facilities, where it's very hard to describe without an image, but you have these sort of troughs and a receiving tube there, and that they could direct the sun. So there's much less of a chance of burning. There are a couple of other issues. Birds collide with the mirror structures, and there's been some studies done on that, but I think just in terms of the numbers of facilities we're likely to see in South Africa, it's not quite as a big concern. But sure, if you want to take a drive up to Uppington and see the future, that thing looks crazy, absolutely crazy.